Welcome to Heartline, conversations with healthcare changemakers following their heartline. I'm your host, Dr. Andrea Austin. I'm an emergency medicine physician, coach, and educator. I believe that healthcare needs to improve the quality care that patients receive, and that supporting the workers is at the heart of this transformation. Welcome to today's episode. I am thrilled to have Dr. Stephanie Byerly with me. She is an obstetrical anesthesiologist, and in recent years, she has turned her focus towards critical issues in healthcare, preventing physician burnout and promoting wellness. After experiencing several episodes of burnout herself, she passionately addressed these challenges in an article called Female Physician Wellness: Are Our Expectations of Ourselves Extreme? Moreover, she has become a certified life coach specializing in helping women in leadership who are exhausted and hyper-functioning. I will raise my hand that I probably need her services. Her mission is to empower these women to reclaim their joy in both their personal and professional lives. And I'm thrilled to have her on the podcast today. Specifically, I am really looking forward to having a discussion about how trauma impacts our careers. And listeners of the podcast know that I've been on my own journey exploring the impact of emotional trauma on our careers. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and talking about trauma is one of my passions. So thank you.
Well, let's start with your own doctor origin story. Why did you become a physician?
I was sick as a little kid in the hospital on and off. And one time there for, about 4 weeks. And this was a long time ago. I'm not going to say how old I am, but it was many decades ago. And I think I looked up to healthcare providers as these amazing people that were taking care of people and nurturing and having some sort of an elevated, I think, just really opinion of what healthcare workers were. So I was around that a lot due to being in the hospital several times. And I always, my family will say that since then I had always said I wanted to be a doctor, and just sort of pursued that. It was really a great story that I'll tell you really quickly, though. When I was little and had my tonsils out, a student nurse who had been taking care of me when I was in the hospital for a month, we used to go around and fill up oxygen tents with ice back in the day. And so she somehow found out I was having a tonsillectomy. And when I woke up, she left me a doctor bag, one of the little plastic doctor bags with the little pills in it and the stethoscope. And somehow she knew that I was to become a doctor. And so journey really started then.
That is so beautiful. It just shows the power of these small moments early on in life and how they can really carry forward. And I try to think about that when I'm interacting with patients and children and family friends.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing because I didn't realize until, probably about 8 or 9 years ago about how my trauma had impacted my life. But I do think one of the main reasons that I did become a physician is because of my traumatic background. Are you familiar with ACEs score, Adverse Childhood Event Survey?
I am, but I think it would be great for you to break that down for listeners.
Oh, I would love to. This was started when a couple of physicians noticed that there were kids coming in with the same types of diseases. And so they did a huge study, and it went up to age 18. And they found that if you have an ACEs score of 4 or more, and so there's 8 or 9, I think there's actually 9 or 10 questions on there, and it asks about, have you seen abuse in your life, neglect? Do you have a parent who's an alcoholic? Do you have a parent or a caregiver who has severe mental illness? Do you see drugs around you? Has somebody been incarcerated? So there's a lot of questions. And if you have an ACEs score of 4 or greater, you do have a chance of dying actually younger because of the chronic illnesses that people get and the exposures to things that happen when you're in an environment where your ACEs score is higher. But what I didn't really realize is that when you have a higher ACEs score, there's also a correlation about going into healthcare. So it's really going into a nurturing profession because for some reason, maybe you weren't nurtured, you didn't maybe get all the attention, or care that you needed as a child. So you see healthcare as something where you can nurture people and take care of people. And I had a lot of trauma in my life, actually, all through my adult life, even up to about 5 years ago. And had no idea, though, how all of that impacted the way I was showing up every day.
Yeah, I think right now we're living through this moment where emotional trauma is having a moment. It's in the zeitgeist, but we still don't have a lot of physicians or healthcare professionals that necessarily really know what it is. And two, even if they are kind of like, yeah, I understand it. I understand that other people, maybe my patients have it. It's not something I have. Could you maybe even make it a little bit more clear what counts as trauma? Because I think some of the feeling physicians get is, well, they're calling everything trauma nowadays.
Yeah.
So what definition do you use or with your clients?
So I love the definition by Dr. Gabor Mate, who is a family practice physician who started treating patients with trauma and realizing that their addictions were based on trauma that was not processed. And so his definition is trauma is not what happened to you, but it's what happened inside of you because of what happened to you. And really understanding that your nervous system decides how it's going to respond based on things that happened to you up until the time you were 6 or 7 years old. So if you do things like fight, flight, freeze, submit, these different reactions that we talk about when our fear response or threat response is activated, all put in place by our body at such a young age. So it's really what happened to us that causes this reaction about what happens inside of us. We don't choose it. So our nervous system pretty much decides if you're going to be a person who responds with fight or flight or freeze or submit. And when you start to understand that, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm not broken. There's reasons all this are happening. My body still thinks that I'm in that situation. So my nervous system vibrates at a very different level than if I hadn't experienced that.
Yeah, I think that's such a great definition. A little bit more crass one, which I'm blanking on the author's name right now, is trauma is something that kicked your ass. And you
Yeah.
get to decide what kicked your ass. And I like that one too, because you may not even know, because some of these reasons why your nervous system is wired a certain way and you're responding a certain way, you may not even have a clear memory of like, why do I
Mm-hmm.
overreact or overreact,
Mm-hmm.
the label we associate with it. So that takes out some of the pull, and that helps you meet yourself. And it also helps you meet your patients where there's not this judgment about whether it was,
Mm-hmm.
quote, a large T or a small t. And for people not familiar with that, large T's might be things that people are more quick to say, well, certainly that was traumatic, that, you were a refugee or you witnessed a violent crime or experienced a violent crime. Like that's definitely a large T versus these smaller T's. I think once you frame it as you did, that it's really about the way your nervous system reacts, and that takes out some of the judgment that comes with it. And the last thing I would say is like, what is the judgment serving? Is it serving you? How is it serving your patients? I've never felt that whether I'm in a hypercritical phase for myself or my patients, that it's actually resulted in anything positive afterwards.
Absolutely. And, the thing they know now that when a woman is pregnant, 4 weeks gestation, if the mother's having trauma or has severe anxiety, it's already getting baked into the baby's nervous system. And so,
Mm.
understanding that the playing field, there's a reason why we are the way we are. And when we start looking at how do you respond in a trauma informed way, realizing that people are coming to the table with different lived experiences. And when we start to bring in racial issues, color and things like that, it's even more exponentially magnified. And we have to have cultural humility when you talk about your patients. We don't understand what everybody comes to the table with every day and what happened in their lives today and what caused them to be in these situations. And so understanding trauma really helps you level the playing field.
So you just said another word I'd like you to unpack. You said trauma informed care, and then later
Mm-hmm.
I want you to get into trauma informed leadership. So, what is trauma informed? What does that mean?
Trauma informed, it doesn't mean you're going to go and you're going to, someone came in acutely with a trauma and you're going to be able to, not, I guess I would say, prevent all of the consequences of it. But what it means is that understanding someone is coming in, they've had some trauma, you're not here to fix, we're talking about, say, emotional trauma. You're not here to fix, you're here to listen, you're here to understand, you're here to not judge, you're here to be a resource and a support, and you're here to also provide other resources that that person may need, and really to have cultural humility. Again, that's a huge piece of this, that we have to approach this with non-judgment, that people are coming to the table not with bad intentions. They're usually coming with good intentions, just don't understand the impact of what they do to people or what's happened to them. So it's very much being accepting of people, non-judgment again, and realizing that there's not going to be closure. You have to embrace non-closure, that you're not going to be able to fix most of the time. You're there to support and listen and have connection. One of the most wonderful things that I learned from this trauma group that I first got certified with and I coach for now is that connection mitigates trauma. So if you were a kid, like for me, one person who was there for you, who paid attention, who made you feel like you made a difference, that's enough to prevent all of the consequences that occur from trauma. So connection mitigates trauma. That's Lodestar. We'll mention them more, but that's their tagline, because it is just so true.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I want to get a bit tactical because I deal with a lot of physicians and I deal with it too. So you go into a patient room and you can already tell from, reading the chart that there's probably some trauma that has
Mm-hmm.
happened to this person. And you walk in there and they immediately start attacking you and they're very upset with everything, and nothing that you're doing that day is good enough. And I know a lot of my physician colleagues will be able to identify with that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's sometimes the people that have the most trauma can be the most difficult to work with. And I think really pull out that judgment piece. And I'm guessing that as an obstetrical anesthesiologist, you run into this too, where maybe people are very upset that they're in pain and they are using maybe projecting of that onto you.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of your quick tips when the verbal projectiles get quite
Mm-hmm.
severe and you maybe started as you walked into that room like I really want to help this person, and now you're just like you're maybe in your own trauma loop, maybe even going back to childhood with someone yelling at you? What do you do in that moment?
Well, let me start out by saying, what you just mentioned, being in your own trauma loop. So when our nervous system senses fear or uncertainty, which is certainly when somebody starts coming at you or raise their voice, and you go into your trauma response, our prefrontal cortex goes offline a little bit and our amygdala starts running the show. So our hippocampus, our amygdala, and it just is like, are we safe or are we not safe? And that's really where it goes. And so what I do now, and I will tell you, I was not great at this before I understood all this, is I will pre-prepare myself. And I work on this all the time, is that I know when I'm going to go into this room, I'm going to take some deep breaths. I'm going to have compassion for myself and for what I'm walking into. And I try to say to myself, what else could be true here? And what happened to this person, not what's wrong with this person. Because again, the judgment piece comes in, and just try to go in and de-escalate the situation and not to make it worse. That's our natural reaction though, because again, it's our nervous system responding to danger. So if you're in a dangerous, true life-threatening situation, that's different. But this is where you're going to go in and just try to have the limbic resonance of compassion and humanness to the other people that may be responding. And it usually de-escalates it when you don't get into that fight, flight, whatever response you get into, and see that you're just listening. And I often say, I'm so sorry for what you're going through. I work in a hospital where we take care of a lot of indigent women. There's a lot of people who come in with no care, don't have great outcomes all the time, and I'm just like, I'm so sorry for what you're going through. And so really it is to bring that human piece, and then they usually de-escalate because you're not continuing to, like to make them get more activated as well. And that's another word that I think is really wonderful to use that I learned through Lodestar was activated instead of triggered, because if you think about triggered, that's such a violent connotation. And it's really that our nervous system is activated. And so when you say I'm activated, my nervous system's activated, and really taking it down to that level. And then you start to realize I can get control of this. But one thing is that if you're not very much, if you don't really understand this, and even if you do, once you're activated, it can take 17 to 23 minutes to calm your nervous system down. So if you don't know how to do things like breath work or other things that you can quickly do to calm your nervous system, it just gets more and more stirred up because your nervous system is like, are we safe or not? Like, do we have to run? Is there a saber-toothed tiger behind us? And that's really what it's thinking. It still thinks we live in a cave.
Yeah, I think that's so, so helpful. So I think that preparation piece that,
Mm-hmm.
how would you expect to be able to be your best self when you're going into a room if you're already activated? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, so getting into a good state before you get there. And, I think the other life-changing concept was one that Brene Brown introduced on her podcast is, do you think people are doing the best that they can? And to fast forward, most of us will finally get to the place where we think people are. And sometimes someone's best is very disappointing, that this is the best that someone can be right now. And that helped me stop being as judgmental. It helped me pull back from it, that if this, based on this person's life experiences, is the best way they can show up right now, what can I do to meet them where they are? And then knowing the neuroscience of mirror neurons, that if you can start to lower your voice and speak more slowly and be that more receptive person, most of the time that's going to get you out. You're going to be in a better place. There's
Yeah,
always exceptions. And we do deal with the exceptions sometimes in our line of work, but that's really the vast majority of the time. And I don't think it's the exceptions that keep us from doing our work. I think it's mainly our day-to-day experiences.
absolutely. And when you're, running from patient to patient and, all the things that are happening with medicine, with being overwhelmed, you're running around just thinking in fight or flight all day, probably. And so one more thing happens and it just pushes you over, into a full, blown reaction. And I think that we really have to give ourselves a lot of self-compassion, actually a lot of like radical empathy for what we deal with every day. And I experience secondary and vicarious trauma all the time at work, and I'm sure that you do as well. And that's processed the same as primary trauma in our brains, and we don't ever get a chance to process that.
Yeah. And I think it would be helpful again if you just make those definitions really clear. And
Yeah,
sometimes I get confused. Is secondary the same as vicarious, or are they two different things?
they're different. So primary is when it's happening to you. So say I was in a car accident and that's primary trauma to me. Secondary trauma is hearing or seeing. So in the emergency room, you see a patient come in who's been traumatized. So you're getting traumatized by seeing what has happened to or listening from that person telling you what happened to them. Vicarious trauma is sort of what we hear say. Just think about the internet, right? We get on the internet, we're doing the doom and gloom scrolling, right? We're reading all these stories, we're getting vicarious trauma through that. You may never even see images, you may just hear a story, but it could be so traumatizing to us that it gets processed as primary trauma in our brain. And so when we talk about how do we adjust that, when people start to understand that you can turn down the level of vicarious trauma, you can turn off the news, you can, maybe not doom scroll on social media. So decrease your exposure the things that we are constantly getting exposed to nowadays. Because if you think about 20 years ago, we didn't have all this 24/7 in our face, these pictures, this, all the things that we see all the time. So we're all getting traumatized constantly. We just
Yeah,
don't realize it.
100%. And I think that vicarious plus secondary, we're recording this after our nation's gone through a very
Mm-hmm.
traumatic experience. And when I watched the video of the assassination attempt on President Trump, it wasn't just that. In
Mm-hmm.
my head, I started to go through the Rolodex
Yeah.
of all the different gunshot victims that I've seen. So I think for healthcare workers, I'd really encourage you to think about that vicarious element that everyone has. I think ours is like amplified exponentially
Yeah.
because it's not just what I'm seeing. It's then my brain goes to, oh, and then there was this patient, and that happened, and
Mm-hmm.
then this. And so it's not just what I see, it's the movie that gets played, unfortunately, in my head.
Yeah. And if it never gets processed, it's always there and it ends up coming out sideways somehow. And so, people that you work with or patients, they may be coming to the table with aggressiveness or apathy or avoidance, or you just think they don't care. And it may not be that. It may just be that they're in one of their trauma responses and this is how they live their lives. I think I walked around numb most of my life, sort of in the state of just surviving, until I started to really understand how my trauma impacted my life.
Yeah. I want to pick up on a thread that you mentioned before, and I know this is something you're really passionate about. You mentioned that the impact of trauma on women and women of color. Can you talk more about your awakening on that and the work that you're doing now?
Yep. I did an advanced feminist coaching certification, and the first day there was 48 of us on a Zoom screen, and the woman who was in charge of this was her program. She said, "Do you know what white feminism was?" And I was like, "White feminism? What is that?" And she was like, "Well, white women think that they have the same amount of oppression as women of color." We were all like, "Oh my gosh." She's like, "We have white privilege." And it really, I think most of us on that screen were like, holy cow, we have a lot to learn. And it's really about that everything that we talk about as women for gender bias, it's amplified 10 times for women of color with everything. And have you ever heard the term weathering before? There's a
No.
book actually called Weathering. So people of color, when they know that they're going to be looked at differently, judge differently, have to work harder, how people have automatic reactions. They come to any situation and they know their nervous system is vibrating up here because they're going to be judged differently. And so they're already coming to the table thinking, I've got to work harder. I've got to be different. I've got to talk this way. I've got to act this way. And oftentimes they're coming to the table with lived experiences that we don't even understand. And and so when you see, especially like what I do, I take care of a lot of African American women when they're having babies. And as we know, the mortality rate is higher for African American women in the United States. So many times talking about a situation that may get, heated is when a woman comes in and they know that. And they say, how are you going to take care of me differently so that I don't die, so that I'm not one of
Mm.
the statistics? So can you imagine how that would be to go in to have a baby and you know that you have a higher chance of dying? And it is when you start thinking about it, you know, it's awful. And being able to actually understand that and teach my colleagues about that has been wonderful because it's just this isn't taught enough. And people that we work with, even when you look at like medical school classes and studies that have been done, until the admissions committee is made aware of their biases, the medical school classes look different. And if we don't have people that look the way the patients look that they're going to take care of, there's a difference in care. So this is it's so complicated and there's so many levels to this, but just knowing that oppression is trauma and people who are oppressed have higher levels of trauma.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I've thought for a long time that the elevated blood pressure, rates of hypertension in Black patients is a physiologic response to oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And I can recall there was a period in my life that I was under real extreme stress, and I had a couple blood pressure readings that were a little bit off. And once that situation resolved, my blood pressure got better. And I remember thinking
Mm-hmm.
to myself, like, wow, to like be under this constant, even just, driving somewhere, thinking that, you could be pulled over and that could result in death
Yeah.
at a much higher probability than it does for white people to walk around with that weight. I mean, no wonder it would come out in higher rates of blood pressure to me. It seems like obvious. And like, of course, that's what would
Yeah.
happen. Your heart is constantly under stress and strain.
Yeah. Yeah, and weathering really talks about that chronic, constant level of having your nervous system in, an elevated response where there's cortisol just, running rampant and causing all the negative effects that it does. And really understanding that again levels the playing field in my mind, and really just looking at things very, very differently and treating people very differently with that understanding.
So, something else that really drew me to having you on the podcast was identifying as a leader in trauma informed leadership. And this, I think, is such an exciting area that you have expertise in because as my mind has been opened to the impact of trauma, it really seems like leaders need to be more aware of this because inevitably you deal with any group of humans you put together, you're going to have somebody
Mm-hmm.
struggling at any given moment. And when I think about various professions, I really think like the way we deal with physicians is particularly punitive. And I'm wondering if this trauma informed leadership has the ability to open the door and start to change that because you've got really capable individuals that have made it through medical school, one of the hardest things you can do. And so if they're having a problem, I guess it just has always really surprised me that the first way many people respond is through this punitive process
Mm-hmm.
versus, what I would envision trauma informed leadership being curious. Like, I want to know more. What's going on?
Yes, absolutely. And, it really has to start with the leaders first. You have to work on yourself first to understand your trauma responses, because oftentimes the way we're leading is through our trauma responses. So it has to start with the leaders, but really it's having organizations support leaders to start to look at the culture, first of all. So there has to be a culture of safety. And we know that changing culture takes years and years. So it has to start at the top. And people have to see the leaders. If you're going to talk the talk, you have to walk the walk. But what that means again is cultural humility, understanding that people are coming to the table with very different lived experiences, building trust, psychological trust. That's that kind of a buzzword, psychological trust, psychological safety. That's not easy to build. And especially when you're talking about having racism be a part of that, but you have to have inclusion safety where everybody feels that they're included. Everybody has a voice at the table. Nobody, is othered, how we talk about that term othering, where people are ignored, or these things that happen, is that everybody's voice is important. It's sort of like what voice are we missing looking around the table? Who else's perspective do we need? Really looking into diversity and having people, gender differences, everybody looks different and they bring their own piece to the table. Safety meaning that you can challenge. So in order for people to feel like they can voice their opinion, they have to feel like they can say, maybe we should do this differently. Because as we know in medicine, so much of it is We've always done it this way. So feeling like you can actually challenge and bring new things to the table, and you're not going to get criticized or an eye roll for that, or retaliation. So basically you can speak your mind if you think things need to be different, self-compassion for all involved, questions of what else could be true. Like you mentioned, being curious, what else is there? Because again, we come to the table thinking everybody has the same life we do, and they don't. So it's looking at people and thinking, what happened to you, not what's wrong with you, and just giving people grace and space and giving people resources. You as a leader are not to be responsible to give all the resources, but provide support when you can, building up trust, and then providing resources or suggesting resources when possible. Now, when we start talking about for physicians, there's so many things that can happen, including peer coaching, coaching, just so many things that can start the process. But physicians are so fearful of all of this because, as you said, it's always been punitive. So we always think there's another motive. Like, why are they doing it? Am I the disruptive physician? Am I in trouble? All these things, because we learned by guilt and shame. We were always told we were supposed to be perfect. I mean, the stakes are high, right? We deal with people's lives, but we live in this constant, especially for women, it's a little different, but I'm not good enough. You get into that whole burnout loop where it's like nothing I do matters. Why am I here? It's just such a vicious cycle. So when we start to have leadership that starts to understand that and starts to create safe spaces for people, to sometimes it's just being heard. Because as I mentioned before, there's a lot of non-closure and non-fixing, and sometimes it's just support and connection and being heard. Because I don't, you've ever heard this before, but hurt people,
Mm-hmm.
but healing people, heal people, and heard people, hear people. And
Mm-hmm.
so sometimes it's just telling your story. And it isn't to discuss the case and what you could have done differently. It's just like, I'm so sorry. That must have been so hard,
Yeah.
terrible. What can I do to you? How can I support you? Not worrying about the root cause analysis and all the other things that are going to happen, but how can I support you as a human right now?
Mm. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing I hope. I mean, I feel like the listeners of this podcast, are the early adopters and the ones that are
Mm-hmm.
doing the work. I mean, I guess that's my question for you. I feel like I had some great leaders in my time, had some not great leaders in my time, and I very much believe hurt people hurt people. It is frustrating though that it does seem like we have a lot of hurt people walking around supposed to be the healers. So aside from quitting, which sometimes is the best answer, but short
Mm-hmm.
of that, when you're dealing with leaders that, you know, they're not really doing the work. They're not really open to this. Maybe they're openly hostile, saying that, people are snowflakes around this
Yeah.
organization. And boy, when I was a resident, it was a lot harder than this. What do you have you found any strategies that have softened? Have you found a way to lead up, I guess, with some of these leaders?
What I have found is that you have to be the one to start the process. So even if it's just one step at a time, when you start to show up in a very consistent manner in this way, and let me back up really quickly. When you look at the life coaching piece, what we learn is that other people don't have control of us. We think that they do. We think we have control over others as well, but we really don't. So it's starting first, I would say the first piece, and this is what was so helpful for me, was to realize I have to take care of myself first, and I have to get my own mindset straight first so that these things don't affect me. I don't allow other people's opinions of me to affect me in this way. So, of course, I look at things and say, okay, of course, sometimes there's going to be things that, I mean, it's far from perfect. Yes, I need to change this. But I look at it very differently. It doesn't automatically land as, oh, they're criticizing me, because I've sort of gotten out of the victim mentality that I think many physicians get into, that everything is just happening to us and we have no control over anything. And I certainly lived there for a very long time. But through coaching is realizing that nobody can make me think or feel or act anyway. It's all about what I'm doing with that information and what I'm making it mean about me. So when I start to show up in an empowered way and I'm happy with the way that I'm showing up, people start to notice that and they start to gravitate towards you because they see the healthy way of doing this. And sometimes things automatically start to shift. And
Hmm.
so I would say it has to start with you first, not responding back. I used to be very reactive and I led a group of men as a very young physician. And they, oh my gosh, I was like, how can they push my buttons like this, until I understood they can't, I'm letting them do that. And so when I started showing up in a very different way, they were like, what are you doing? Why are you so different? What's going on? And then their response to me started changing because they started realizing they didn't have that effect on me anymore.
Hmm.
And so that's a piece that's so critical, I think, is that yes, the system is broken. No one is going to argue with you about that. But we have to take care of ourselves. And there are ways to do that. Um, did any of us think that this was going to be the way that medicine was when we went into it? Absolutely not. But we have to take care of ourselves. We have to heal the healers.
Hmm. Yeah, 100%. And I still believe that there are opportunities and there's enough of a need right now in medicine that you're not going to find any perfect place. But I do think you can find a place, or you can create it. Physicians can open up their own practices that you
Mm-hmm.
can create a place that you can find fulfillment.
Absolutely. And looking at mindset is really, what are your expectations? Maybe it's time to look at your expectations and say, uh, you know, this isn't maybe reality anymore. Or, how do I start looking at this differently every day when I go to work? I do a little morning routine where I pre-decide how I'm going to show up that day. I think about clinical situations that could happen and I decide my tone of voice, my body language, so that I don't get myself into that negative spiral, I will say. And I've learned just how to do that over time. Again, I do a lot of breath work, mindset work. All of this is really important for what we do. We high stress all the time, and then when we go home, it's not necessarily different. It can be. It's just we're all doing too much, and especially as women, that's a whole nother story. But where our to-do lists and the perfectionism, all the things. So gotta start taking care of ourselves. We take care of everybody else. It's time to start putting ourselves back on our to-do list.
Mhm. I'm thinking that there's going to be some listeners that this has really resonated with them. I think there was so much unhealed trauma pre-pandemic, and I think there's a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
out there that still really haven't processed the pandemic. How can our listeners reach out to you and connect with you?
So my website is stephaniebyerly.com, and on social media for LinkedIn and for Instagram and Facebook, it's at Stephanie Byerly MD. So I would love to hear from people. They can set up a breakthrough call if they just want to chat. This is just my passion to help people understand this. Most of my clients don't really understand about any trauma they've had. And when we don't dig into the trauma, but when it comes up and it's like, okay, now this all makes sense. And it changes the playing field. It really does. Very important though, if people are interested in trauma, learning about trauma in sort of a way from an organization. Lodestar, it's a consulting executive coaching run by a physician who's amazing, Dr. Kimia Saraf. She has a trauma mitigation masterclass. It's like 8 weeks. It's wonderful. That's where I started. And then I ended up getting certified through that organization as a trauma informed professional coach. And there's certainly so many organizations that people didn't understand 10 years ago what trauma did to us. And now the research just keeps exploding. So many resources.
And one of the questions I've enjoyed asking listeners is there a medical conference, or is there any conferences related to coaching or trauma informed care that you would recommend? I think conferences are such a great way for people to connect.
Yes, there is. So there's an organization called it's NICBAM. So it's the National Institute of basically clinical and behavioral medicine. It's really geared a lot towards therapists and coaches. They have a lot of online conferences, but they also have in-person conferences. And they feature people like Dr. Gabor Mate and Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote a famous book called The Body Keeps the Score. So very, very many leaders in trauma who run these conferences. And then some of the physician conferences, especially the women's physician conferences, are going to talk about trauma. I'm presenting at a couple coming up, which is really exciting. But people are starting to really understand this is important and we have to deal with our own trauma first.
Absolutely. I think a common expression is, leaders need to lead themselves first. And I think maybe what the byline of this podcast is, we need to heal ourselves first too. I mean, it's always been the last few years, I guess, doing this work. Like, how would you expect to heal somebody when, your work, a lot of us are kind of walking around, as my one friend, Dr. Landa, likes to say, as like an open pressure ulcer.
Yeah, we're the walking wounded, right? I mean, yeah, absolutely. And we're not given time to ever process any of it. We don't even understand it. That's the thing.
Well, is there anything else that I didn't ask you or anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
The one thing I would say, because I do specialize in women, is that women in leadership get traumatized. And so I think often we don't realize the effects of gender bias. And again, certainly if you're a woman of color, but we need women in leadership. This is my passion too, is we have to have women in leadership. And so many women are leaving leadership. They say for every one woman that gets promoted into a leadership role, two are leaving. And a lot of it is because we get traumatized about the things that happen to us. And that's my passion, is to help women understand that. And how do we get through all that so that we can lead confidently and have the impact that we want to have on this planet for what we want to heal the planet.
Yeah, I think a good closing thought is, one of my favorite saying is strong back and soft heart. That's a mantra that I will use. I think for a long time I had the emphasis on strong back and really hardening of the heart. And it was that softening and leaning back into, the truest self that has really helped me. The other one I love is, let people be wrong about you. Essentially, you don't have to manage your image. And when you let that go, that one was such a huge thing for me. Let that person be wrong about you, that, they've developed this thought about you, and maybe it'll change through more interactions. Maybe it won't, but boy, that one was a game changer.
Yeah, because you really don't have control over that as long as you're showing up the way that you want to be showing up. And as one thing as women, it's interesting if you think back to why we want everybody to like us and why this whole take care of everybody else is, because back in the caveman days, if you weren't liked, you got kicked out of the cave. So, I mean, this stuff goes back to, when civilization first began, and it's in our DNA for women. It's our epigenetics. It's all the things. And so there's reasons when you start to understand, you're like, okay, I am not broken. May need to change some things, but now I understand.
Well, it's been such a treat having this conversation with you. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for doing the important work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on your podcast and for all the amazing work you're doing as well.
Thanks for listening to Heartline, conversations with healthcare changemakers following their heartlines. I'd so appreciate it if you could take a quick moment and hit the like button and also the subscribe button that you'll find within your podcast app or platform that you're listening on. It also really helps if you can leave a review. I would certainly appreciate a 5-star review and a few comments about what you liked about this podcast. Don't forget, you can also forward this to people in your network. People love getting new podcasts and changing up what they're listening to. So sending a podcast to a friend or colleague, or even to start a conversation about a change that needs to happen in your organization, is a great way to be a change maker. This podcast represents the views of the host and guests. It does not represent the views of any entity we work for or with. It is also for informational use only and does not replace any professional advice, including medical or psychological. If you are interested in unlocking your true potential, reach out to me. If you're an organization interested in supporting the well-being of your people, I'd love to connect on innovative solutions. Schedule a strategy session at AndreaAustinMD.com. Sound editing services are provided by Better Podcasting Services, and you can find their website at betterpodcastingservices.com. And I'd also like to thank our future Dr. Caitlin Din, who is the production assistant for this podcast.